Hello and welcome to this video. Today I am joined with Zach from Zach's Strange Corners of Thought. Is that right?
That is correct. And I
to
am
discuss abortion.
Yes, such a non-controversial and friendly topic. And I am joined by Joshua Yen of Philosophy for All. Thank you so much for making a wrong turn and getting lost in one of my strange corners of thought. Very happy to have this.
Well, we'll see who gets lost in whose strange corners of thought, I suppose, by the end of this video. But I suppose how these videos will go is that I am going to start off with talking about my first few arguments why I think abortion is morally wrong, and Zach would then give his thoughts about it and give a few thoughts about my arguments and my ideas. So first of all, I would like to start off with quite a simple argument. I think this goes along the lines of modus ponens argument, a simple idea of the fetus is not the mother and is a human being, and also that the fetus is a living human being. Since murder is a termination of a living human being, then it follows that abortion is wrong, since abortion is the termination of a fetus, which is a living human being separate from the mother. So in support of the first argument, I would argue that the fetus is not the mother and is a human. The reason for this is because the fetus has human DNA. The DNA is completely separate from the mother. The DNA has, if you looked at the genetic code of the fetus and you looked at the genetic code of the mother, you see those are two different people there. And then furthermore, I would argue the reason why it's also separate from the mother is because I think it is not justified to say that just because something is within something or dependent on something, that the thing which is dependent on the other thing, A, which is dependent on B, is part of B. I would say that's merely a logical fallacy, just as someone who's connected to a hospital bed in life support to a wider hospital in which they're within is not part of the hospital in the same way that a lot of people would like to claim that the fetus is part of the mother, and as a result, the mother should have a choice to do what she wants with her body. And as a result, from these two reasons, I'll say the fetus is not part of the mother and is a human being. Now, the second reason why I would argue the fetus is a living human being is that it carries out, or has at least the potential to carry out, the 7 life processes, which is movement, reproduction, sensitivity, growth, respiration, excretion, and nutrition. Now, the reason why I put potential and actual, I think that this is going to be an area of potential disagreement, but I think the potential and actual should be considered the same here, is because a human baby who is just born is considered by all to be a living human being. However, that living human being, which is a baby born at 9 months of pregnancy, cannot reproduce straight away. Nevertheless, we still consider them a living human being because they have the potential to carry out that life process in the future and show signs of being able to reproduce due to the fact that they have ovaries and gonads and just potential sexual reproductive organs, which can be found in a fetus in their process of development by the SRY chromosome and all those processes. If they work correctly, those things would develop as well. So as a result, following that argument, it would classify the fetus as a living human being, from which the rest of the premises follow, which is the fetus is a living human being, murder is the termination of a living human being, and abortion is a termination of human being. Murder is wrong, therefore abortion is wrong. Now that is perhaps a more scientific argument, which I suppose both of us perhaps might not be too interested in going into. It gets thrown around a lot, I assume. And while we can discuss the intricacies of it, I think we might be quite more interested in a metaphysical twist, which is my second argument. And this metaphysical twist is the idea that value is intrinsic to human beings and are tied to them by virtue of them being human beings, and not by virtue of extrinsic factors. So it's not tied to their utility towards a certain goal. It's not tied towards their ability to carry out anything, but rather them, by virtue of being human, have certain values and certain rights which cannot be taken away from them. Now, the width of those rights, the breadth of those rights, depends, of course, on the individual. For example, or depends on kind of the scope of where you want to draw it. And a lot of people will have a lot of ideas on where you should draw those lines. And to some degree, for this debate, I think it's not really very important to draw an exact kind of circle of where those lines are. Rather, I would just argue that as human beings, they have the minimal rights, the basic rights to life and the right not to perish. Those are the two rights I think is key to every single human being. And beyond that, people might add in other things. There might be good arguments for that, but I would say those are irrelevant. I think every human being has value, and that value includes a basic right to life and the right not to perish, and it's not tied to intrinsic properties. So I'll say those are a few arguments that come off the top of my head when I'm thinking about the debate of abortion. And if you have any disagreements or objections, the floor is yours, I suppose.
Yeah, so first off, I distinguish between human life, which, so for instance, all of our cells are human life. But we don't, I don't care if I scratch myself and I kill some cells like that, or if I have some type of surgery. And then I guess we would probably equate human being and human personhood. Would you agree that that's kind of the same thing?
Yeah, I think the devil lies in the detail, in the sense of whether you would consider a dead body a human being. I would say perhaps not, and personhood and being would be significant, I suppose, in that distinction. Just because I think a human person would have rights, though of course a lot of times they are used interchangeably, such that what one person says as being might be what someone else says as person, and then the equivocation occurs there, right? So I think we have to be careful about that distinction. Though I do believe that, all things being equal, if we view a person as someone with value and someone who carries out choices, that might be different from a human being, which is, I have human DNA and I have the potential to carry out choices and I have value. There's a small difference there, and depending on where you want to draw the line, I could define either one as one categorization or the other, if you get what I mean. I think we have to be careful.
Yeah, just going forward, if I say a human being or a human person, I am equivocating those terms. Mm-hmm. And so that is the specific thing that's important to me. And so I don't believe that a fertilized egg, a zygote, an embryo, a fetus, however it self-identifies, which in my view, it doesn't actually have the ability to self-identify, mm-hmm. Is a human person yet. I don't believe that personhood actually starts until the moment of birth. And so I take a very Heideggerian approach to this, and this idea that human beings can be defined as beings in the world. Like, we are naturally in a world that we care about, that we can't be abstracted from this world. And part of those fundamental characteristics are that we can be absorbed in a world, that we can find meaning in a world, that we have a type of facticity that throws us into a world. And obviously you could argue that there is a type of facticity that exists in a fetus. I would say that facticity exists, but it's not quite exactly the same thing. And to me, I do think that there is a metaphysical distinction, and I use a lot of scientific evidence to kind of buttress that. I don't know if that's a dangerous thing to do, to use scientific evidence for metaphysical arguments. But I do think that there is a metaphysical distinction between a fetus, something that's preborn, and then someone who is born, that there's like a shift that happens there. Beyond that, I would, as far as the morality of it, even if I say I granted your argument that a fetus, anything that's preborn during that gestational period, is a human being, I would then make, I guess, what is it called? The violinist argument. I don't know why we're doing so many things against violinists, but I would make the argument that, so for those that are unfamiliar, my understanding of the violinist argument is that basically if a person needs a liver transplant in order to live, I cannot force another person to give me their liver, even if it means that I would die. And so I would carry that same argument with a fetus, that they cannot force a mother, a woman, or potential mother, a woman, to give up their own bodily resources to keep them alive. But honestly, I really do think that the fetus has kind of the same status that any organ in a body has while it's in that phase of being a fetus, of being inside a person's body. And I think I'll leave that as just kind of like my opening of where I am, and then we can just kind of discuss it. So yeah.
I think you've raised some really, really excellent points, because I think you've picked upon some ideas which are very interesting, and I think they open up some truly strange corners of thoughts, I suppose, which we can then go on and pursue. So let's start off perhaps with the first point, which is personhood. And I suppose you gave a kind of a broad conception of what personhood means. You've thrown in Heideggerian ideas of being in the world, that they experience a sense of thrownness. I suppose to develop it a bit more, I suppose to push you a bit more on that, what would you say are the exact qualities of personhood? Can you draw those exact qualities of personhood, or is it almost a more abstract idea of this is a person? Like, because I suppose with like science, they could say, okay, it's these 7 things, or the potential of these 7 things to occur. Do you have a similar kind of rigorous definition of what a personhood means?
Yeah, and so again, I'm going to follow Heidegger on this. You know, he says basically the basic existential characteristics of what it means to be a human, and he calls these equiprimordial. So they're basically a priori. They exist throughout the entire time that you're a human. They're completely unconscious. I don't have to consciously choose to do these, and they're kind of your disposedness is one way of translating this German word Befindlichkeit. It's also literally the state in which you were found, and temporally it refers to your past. So that's the thrownness part, that you always have a kind of history, and that it's being thrown into like a present world. And that in this present world that you and I are both in right now, we are inherently absorbed in the world. We deeply care about the world, so much that we're able to give meaning to the world. And then the final characteristic is what he calls understanding, and that's kind of ambiguous in the way it's translated, but it basically means like I can sketch out future possibilities. I can understand my future possibilities, or I can have some idea of what these future possibilities are. And not just that, but I can go backwards, and I can remember choices that I've made in the past, and I can say, oh, well, there were these other possibilities that I could have made. And so I think that would be a distinction that Heidegger would make between a person and an animal. And I don't want to get into that debate specifically, but I do think that you require all of those specific things. So when it comes to specifically being born, and I know that there will be a lot of contention from people about this, to me, the act of breathing, that first breath, because when you first start breathing and when the umbilical cord touches air, the umbilical cord shuts down. So it's really throwing you into a situation where it's either breathe and live, or don't breathe and cease living. And even though this is like when we talk about choice, this is an unconscious choice. This is like, I don't expect an infant to be thinking this out. And that's really what Heidegger's trying to get at, that a lot of these choices are completely unconscious and unreflective, but we do have these options. These options do exist. And so once that is, you're basically put face to face with the possibility of death. And so if you breathe, if that occurs, then you're essentially dodging death, and you're doing so in a way that is autonomous from prior, when you were a part of the mother, where literally your existence completely depended on your ability to gain nutrients from the mother. And a lot of people say, well, look, babies are helpless, they can't take care of themselves. But once a baby's born, you can literally give them to anybody, and as long as they give them nutrition, right, they'll drink milk, and they'll defecate and urinate and do all the things that are reasons I don't have kids, because I don't want to deal with that. And so yeah, they do have this like basic level of kind of pre-reflective autonomy that I think is an essential characteristic of being a human, even though it's not the type of like Sartrean free will where every single decision I make is a conscious decision. They have these options that they face in the world, and that even instinctively they are making a difference between them, even if they're relatively helpless, even if they require other people. Because one of the things that Heidegger says is that a basic part of being a human is that we have a relationship with others, right? He's completely against the kind of Cartesian solipsism. It's like, how could you even imagine what a human being would be outside of society, outside of some social context? That's like just absurd to even think. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question a little bit, but
I think that does answer the question, and does provide a bit of more of a solid framework of the situation. Now, I suppose there are immediately some questions which spring to mind on that definition. Firstly, I think since we are talking about the unconscious instead of the conscious, the question does arise of whether fetuses who are within the womb also experience a similar unconscious experience of being, I suppose, in this situation, aborted or not being aborted, just as even though they may not be able to think about it, they are still in face of a potential death or not death before they enter into the world in a literal sense of being separate from the mother. So there is that unconscious risk, and I suppose that unconscious risk of living or dying, just as someone who, I suppose, let's bring back the situation of a man who's in a coma in a hospital dependent on life support, is at the same time, although unconscious, also facing the potential death or non-death decision if someone turned off his life support. So I suppose there's that similar, I suppose, unconscious ability which a fetus may be facing. Now, of course, you might come back and say, well, all right, but the fetus is actually in the world now. He is breathing. But I would say, well, what actually is so much difference between a fetus who is still in the mother's womb or someone who's just been born and the umbilical cord is cut? In the sense that when someone's in the womb and the umbilical cord is not cut yet, they still have the unconscious processes. But when someone's born, they don't really have the unconscious processes. They don't have the conscious process as well. And they still have the unconscious processes. And now you could say, well, okay, I'm older now. I could breathe unconsciously, or I could decide to stop breathing consciously. If I could suddenly stop breathing now, I'd be like, Josh, I'm going to stop breathing for the next 3 seconds. All right, I'm not breathing, but I'm still talking. Okay, 3 seconds is stopped. Okay, now I'm starting to breathe again. But a fetus has no actual choice to have that control over themselves to say, I'm going to stop breathing now in 3 seconds, then I'm going to start breathing again. They have no idea about that at all. In the same way, a lot of their choices are also unconscious, in the same way that if they were born maybe 5 days before or 6 days before, they would still have the exact same thought processes as they were within the womb or without the womb. So I think there are those fundamental differences where the line gets very difficult to be drawn if we are going to base it on this conscious or unconscious decision of being in the world or not. In the same way that thrownness, of course, acts as different degrees of relevance the longer you are outside of the womb. I don't think it's very easy to say, well, all right, let's go back here and then stop it there. Let's go back there and then cut it there. I don't think it is as simple, or at least as definitive as perhaps the more scientific version of, well, okay, respiration, whatnot, movement, whatnot, right? Though, of course, by nature of raising Heidegger, by nature of raising this existential landscape, I'm not saying let's demand the exact same rigorousness that we can have from science. I'm not really demanding that. But what I do think is that if we were to say that humans have value, or at least the value is tied intrinsically to some sort of existence or some sense of existential form, we at least have to have some kind of idea which there's this clear, very obvious symmetry breaker between the fetus and a being which was just born. Unless you then say, or I suppose someone can make the argument, which is something along the lines of, well, all right, the value and human existence doesn't actually even occur when someone is born. It occurs the moment they first make a conscious choice in the world. And that, I think, is perhaps even a stronger argument, though, of course, it does raise a problem of, well, all right, if we could abort, like, fetuses, can we then now go and kill babies until they make the first conscious choice in the world? I think that argument is actually a very powerful one with less support. So if I was, like, playing devil's advocate, I would say that actually is a very strong existential argument. But, of course, does the baggage beyond that hold? Do you have any thoughts about what I've just said?
So I do want to come back to that argument about infanticide, because there are people with more extreme positions than I do that try and make a philosophical justification. And I want to explain why I think that's wrong. But let's come back to that, and let's come back to the case of someone in a coma. So if we're just dealing with the fetus, I would say its possibility of death would be the same as any other organ or cell in the body. Now, there's another answer that I have to this that's then going to start relying on science, on certain scientific facts that we know. So when it comes to brain development of the fetus, the hormones that are being, that the fetus is receiving, especially from the placenta, basically kind of keep it in a sense of sleep almost. They really, it's a sedation that the fetus is going through. So we do talk about how, you know, they might recognize heartbeats and they recognize certain sounds. And at that point, I would say that that's a sedimentation process that's building up on the brain. But the brain is functioning in a fundamentally different way than once you were born. And the evidence that we have for this is babies that are born, you know, very premature prior to when the brain is fully developed, their brain, despite not being fully developed, will automatically switch on in the same way that someone that's born at 9 months, that their brain would switch on and make a fundamental shift. The problem is that their brain structures just aren't there, and so that's what ends up causing a lot of mental disabilities and problems that can come about with being born premature. So I do think that at least the science shows that there are these kind of like significant shifts that happen prior to being born, that it's really behaving in a different way, to where the fetus really isn't absorbed in the womb in the same way that even a newborn is, just because of the different ways that the brain is functioning. I would also point out that we know, for instance, that the cells of a fetus, the mitochondria in all the cells of a fetus, function differently while it's in the womb than when it's born. So as soon as a baby is born, the mitochondria become significantly more active than they were previous. So again, this is me relying on certain scientific facts to buttress my metaphysical arguments, and that may be philosophically problematic, but I'm still going to use them anyway. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what I would respond to the question: is there really a significant distinction between pre-birth and birth? And that's why I keep going back to, like, this is the strong delineation between when you start seeing this thing that is actually achieving this kind of personhood, this kind of human, because they are actively, once they're born, in a way that they're not while in the womb, being engaged in their world and starting to kind of develop these very primitive understandings of what's around. So yeah, I think that's how I would respond to that. I don't know if that's convincing at all, or if that answers the questions that you had, but
I think it does raise an interesting point. I don't think we'll touch too much upon how science kind of matches onto metaphysics, but I do think what it does raise is that there is a certain change when someone enters the world. I would happily grant that. However, I think when you're trying to implant that, or at least kind of transpose it into a metaphysical or existential landscape, what you then reach is that that's not exactly the only way of viewing existentialism. For example, and this just comes off the top of my head, if we take into the idea of Kierkegaard's idea of becoming and being a Christian in Fear and Trembling and whatnot, and his other works, what you notice is that becoming a Christian is just as significant, even more significant than the actual being of a Christian. The act of becoming is itself a mode of being. Now, you might say, okay, that seems a bit kind of out of the blue, but what I think is interesting thing is that if we were to grant another framework of existentialism, which I don't think is too different from Heidegger's one, you get a framework where becoming a human being is almost just as important, if not even more important, than the act of being a human being itself, such that they're two separate modes of being with equally significant existential value to them. And even if one is not completely conscious, or their brain hasn't completely switched on at that moment, there still are things and still are stimuli which are working towards a certain goal. And if we turn to Heidegger himself as well and accept that framework, the idea of aletheia as truth, the idea of reaching out into the unknown, I think even if you say we're reaching out to the unknown in a very obscure way at the start as fetuses, there still are ways of reaching out to the unknown. Yes, unknown is very dark, but at the same time, I would say that is to be expected, because if we start off in the chance of a baby, his understanding, his ability to understand the world is way more difficult than me now with a computer in front of me, with Google and whatnot. As you grow older, as you're developing, that ability to uncover the truth is naturally to be expected, get easier over time. So if we're going to say, well, all right, the fetus has a very difficult ability, or it's almost impossible for them to have a complex understanding of the truth, or at least interact with the truth and the unknown in a certain degree of sophistication. Yes, that might be the case. But would that not be expected, I suppose, of a fetus who has just been conceived and is just starting to develop his understanding of the world, beginning his journey of uncovering the truth? Yes, he might first start learning the heartbeat, or might recognize some voices, but he's experienced absolutely nothing before. He doesn't have a computer. He doesn't have 18 years of experience or whatnot. So of course it's going to be more difficult then. So I suppose from that framework, you could say, well, actually, yes, the fetus is the beginning of the uncovering of truth, not the, I suppose, the breath, which is the beginning of the uncovering of truth.
Yeah, and so with that, we would have to make a distinction of when something like obviously a fertilized egg isn't experiencing anything like that. It's not, none of that is becoming sedimented. So you might have to wait until, and then this is a nebulous scientific question itself. When does something like sensory perception, when does that become a possibility for a fetus, right? It's not at the 3rd month. It's not the 4th month. There's arguments among some pro-lifers, and just for the sake of this argument, I'm going to call them pro-lifers, because in the political debate in the U.S., us pro-choicers typically call pro-lifers just anti-choice. But for the sake of this argument, I'll just call them pro-life, just so that we're not confusing anybody. But there's argument, right? So a lot of pro-lifers will make the argument that at this point we know that a fetus can feel pain. But then if you talk to like a neuroscientist about it, it's like, well, the connections aren't really there to be the same as pain. Yeah, so I guess that would depend on like where would, if there is such a thing as consciousness in the human sense for a fetus, where would that begin during that process? Because I don't know if you agree with this. I don't believe that a fertilized egg has consciousness, personally.
I mean, I would say that, at least in relation to my arguments, I would say that whether it has consciousness or not is something which is almost irrelevant, just because it is quite a difficult idea to grasp. And consciousness has a lot of implications, which I think is not fully developed, and we don't fully understand what consciousness means yet. In the same way that if someone, and I suppose AI is not a good example, but I suppose it is a good example if someone believes that the world is deterministic, then you have really big problems with what actually is consciousness. I mean, if AI is deterministic by certain codes and humans are deterministic by certain factors, I mean, you very much could have a conclusion that humans are the same as AI and whatnot in regards to consciousness. Those things.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, because there is a certain point where a fetus definitely appears to start being able to take in sensory information. Right?
Yeah.
That sounds to be like more of what you're talking about. And obviously, yes, consciousness is a very nebulous term. In fact, Heidegger never uses the word consciousness because he thinks it's too much steeped in this Western metaphysics, which is a whole different discussion. But so it sounds like you're saying, like, when is it that a fetus can actually start experiencing sense perception? And one of the things, again, if we refer to the science, is that there does appear to be this kind of sedimentation process, and that's how a fetal brain develops, right? Is that it is receiving certain kinds of sensory perception, and so that helps in the wiring of a fetus. So does that sound more like what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, I think there is some sense of a reaction to external stimuli, and also a reaction to the external world in which is being recognized by the body, or at least acts in a recognizable way. Now, in that sense, you could say, well, all right, the fetus, a fertilized egg doesn't have that potential, or doesn't have that ability at the very start, and that could be and I think that's the case. I think you have to grant that, but at the same time, I think when it comes to that argument of just the fertilized egg itself, I would say this goes back to the further background of the idea of becoming, is that, yes, it might not be experiencing at start, but that is the process of becoming. In the same way that someone who has never heard of Christianity at all and is just introduced to Christianity might not know anything about it at all at the start. But that doesn't change the fact that they're becoming a Christian, or they're on the way to becoming a Christian. Now, I've been surrounded by a lot of Catholics recently, and they're all saying, as a Christian, they're like, oh, you are becoming a Catholic. And they've been telling me that over like the last, like, I don't know, 6-7 months I've known them. And at the start, I'm like, well, I'm like a Protestant. At a point, I was a Calvinist. I'm like, there's no way on earth as a Calvinist I was ever going to become a Catholic. But then they're like,
are you a Calvinist?
That's well, I used to be a Calvinist, and like, and I had this, like, I don't know what you would call it, a bit of a James White. I'm not sure whether you've ever come across that, a old guy, but I had a bit of a Calvinist phase, like when I was like 14 or whatnot. And I was talking to my friends about it, and they're like, but then that was the process of becoming a Catholic, all part of God's plan. And you know, like, it's these things where you're like, depending on where you're putting your framework, depending on where you're lining it up, I would not see any argument where we can draw a line. Apologies, that's my rice cooker. But it is just I can't see where we could draw a line definitively to say, well, all right, that is not a stage of becoming, or that is a becoming, just in the same way that I think there will always be a small kind of conflict between what do we define by personhood. And I suppose what that leads to as well, I think it's very difficult for us to say, well, definitively, is abortion right at this stage or at that stage? Because no matter where you draw the line, there's always going to be problems about it. And well, what's the reasonable solution? I suppose that goes to the pragmatic side of the debate, which is, I suppose, something slightly different as well. But I was wondering what thoughts you have on that so far.
Well, so I guess my question is, like, so for me, metaphysically or ontologically, I am very close to like what Nietzsche or Deleuze would be, where all of existence is becoming, right? Whether it's living existence or not. So then my question for you is that, do you believe that qualitatively there's the becoming of a human is different than the becoming of, like, you know, the rest of totality, right? That exists. Is it just the same process, or is it a fundamentally different type of process? Because that's kind of what I'm hearing. But then I would go back and say, well, all of reality is constantly becoming, right? So I don't know. Yeah, I would want to understand if you have a stricter distinction between that or not.
Well, I think I would agree with the Nietzschean idea that everything is in a state of becoming, but I do think there's a qualitative difference between what types of becoming is occurring. And that qualitative distinction comes from, I quite like to lean on Berdyaev's distinction, and he's quite an exclusive or elusive Russian thinker on the side. But in his works, Destiny of Man, he does talk about the idea of humans' ultimate value and ultimate telos being the idea of becoming creators. And I quite like the idea, because what separates humans from at least the recognizable world around us is that we have the ability to create, at least in some sense, a minimized illustration of the creatio ex nihilo of God. And as a result, by creating, that is the ultimate value and the ultimate good of human life and human existence. And as a result, I would say that the process of becoming for fetuses and of humans and whatnot is judged by their ability to create and develop ideas and music, or whatever field of creation it is in the world, which is a good. And as a result, I'll say that is a qualitative difference when it comes to the existential mode of becoming between humans and a rock or a tree or whatnot.
So I mean, because, and full disclosure to everyone, I am an atheist. So obviously you as a theist believe in souls, or at least I'm assuming you believe in a soul. So at what point in development would a fetus or an embryo or even a fertilized egg become imbued with a soul, if you were just to have to guess? It's not like the Bible's very clear about.
Yes, definitely. Well, the Bible's not clear about a lot of things, hence why there are some Calvinists and some Protestants and some Lutherans and some and that list goes on and on and on forever, right? So but I mean, I suppose the reason why I haven't raised anything about religion at all up until this point is because I think there's a lot of metaphysical baggage or whatnot, which I think is somewhat irrelevant, or, well, it is very relevant, but at the same time, it's not something that I necessarily want to raise because it leads to a lot of other questions, and hence I'm trying to make this argument as irreligious as possible. However, if we do raise the idea of, because I do think personally, like, even if I wasn't a theist, I would still be pro-life. So I mean, I'll put that out there. So
they're not mutually exclusive.
But then,
and there are people that are Christians that are pro-choice as well.
Definitely. So. But if you do tell me to guess where the soul comes in, honestly, first I'll say I'll do the Catholic answer, saying it's a divine mystery. Who on earth knows, and whatnot. But
it's not the quickening. That what was it, St. Thomas? That was like, it happens at the quickening or something.
Perhaps yes, I think it does. But I guess they quite like the mysteries in the Catholic Church and in tradition, mystery of the sacraments, which is very beautiful, I have to say. But I do think that if I had to just guess, and this is just out of complete guess, and I have absolutely no reason behind it, I'll probably say when the fetus starts in heartbeat or whatnot. I think that's a good sign, and I think the fetus starts a heartbeat quite early on. I could be completely wrong, and I'm talking completely out of left field here. There's absolutely no justification for this. Like, if you gave me another good argument for something else, I'll just change my view in an instant. It's one of those things where I haven't put much thought into it, just because I haven't thought much about it in relation to the abortion debate, but you know, I would say it's heartbeat or whatnot. I mean, there might be another life process which actually starts earlier, but something along those lines.
And I don't mind including, you know, some of the religious presuppositions that you have, because they are, I mean, they're constitutive of your beliefs in general. And even as an atheist, like I am still actually very interested. That's one of the reasons I like your channel, is because I can watch a lot of philosophy of religion that I don't normally get exposed to. So if I were to acknowledge that a soul exists, you know, I would be definitely, I don't know about a heartbeat. Do you believe that animals have souls?
I have absolutely no clue about that. The amount of evidence I have behind animals having souls is exactly the same amount of evidence I have for when souls occur. I have absolutely no clue about that, to be honest.
Yeah. So I mean, if I were to speculate on when souls exist, because, you know, especially since Descartes, and if you take a more secular viewpoint, we really seem to equate souls with consciousness, right? With the mind. Yeah. And so if I were to make that argument, and I would never make that argument because I hate Descartes, I would say it's whenever the brain is able to have this like basic thing that we call consciousness, or has that basic possibility. And of course, we talked about this earlier, there'd be a difference between possibility and actuality. And to me, that's a hard distinction. And I mean it in that's a very strict distinction between what is possible and what is actually occurring right now. That's actually really important to my philosophy, even though Heidegger is constantly talking about possibilities and how they interact with stuff. So yeah, I mean, and that kind of goes back to the argument, right? Most people would say, well, a fertilized egg has a very good potentiality of becoming a human being. And there are some pro-choicers that might be, I think I've probably made this argument before, not seriously, but that, you know, a fetus could be the equivalent of cancer. But as far as we know, the cancer has because it has different DNA, right? But as far as we know, cancer has no possibility of becoming its own independent human.
Family Guy.
Huh?
Have you watched Family Guy?
Well, yeah, but
there's that episode where Peter randomly grows a second Peter out of his shoulder or whatnot. I mean, when you said cancer has no chance of growing into a life of its own, I just think that idea of like Peter growing a second Peter just came into my
maybe
head.
In the Family Guy cinematic universe, that's a possibility.
Yes. That's a rebuttal that everyone needs.
Yes. But I mean, so I mean, one other thing that I want to point out, because you mentioned how at the point of fertilization there's different cells, and I know that we've talked about this before, but I mean, I read a study, and I'll put it in the description of my video and I can share it with you, that basically said, you know, when we talk about gut bacteria that doesn't have our DNA at all, that there's actually more individual gut bacteria cells than all the other cells in our body. And so at a fertilized egg, they don't have any gut bacteria, but you need your gut bacteria in order to survive, right? Like there's people who, if they lose it, they literally have to get like fecal transplants from other humans in order to get that gut bacteria back. Otherwise you can't properly get nutrients. So, you know, I could potentially argue that in order to be a human, you actually have to have all of these cells in your body that don't have your DNA whatsoever. Right, I could potentially make that argument. So I don't know. That's why I would say a fertilized egg is not itself a person, or that's one of the things that I would use to make that argument.
But I suppose we were moving a bit towards a fetus as the same status as an organ. Am I right when we're moving towards that form of the argument that you were raising at the beginning?
That is my metaphysical belief, that the fetus is an organ, and that, you know, all organs and organ systems have a certain purpose, right? And so the entire, you know, reproductive system is for the purpose of reproducing, of creating an other that is not merely a part of the whole. And so for my argument, you know, just as a uterus and a fallopian tube and ovaries and all that fun stuff is an organ and it has a specific purpose, the fetus itself is an organ and has the purpose of being born and becoming an other. So it does have the potentiality of becoming an other. It's not a necessary potentiality, but it does. It's very likely well, I don't even want to say it's very likely. It is like that is its purpose, is to be born and become an other completely independent from the mother and the whole reproductive system that it's a part of while it is gestating, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that, and the reason why I raise that is just because if you're thinking about gut bacteria in your last argument, the gut bacteria is only there with the purpose to help people absorb nutrients. But the fetus, he doesn't need that gut bacteria yet because the nutrients are coming through the umbilical cord. And as a result, what the umbilical cord is to, I suppose, teleologically to the fetus is what the gut bacteria and that entire digestive system is doing for the mother. So as a result, I would say that the actual purpose or the actual end of gut bacteria is not necessarily a very significant kind of indication to say the fetus is either separate or independent of the mother, just because of how the different anatomies work in both circumstances. Now the idea of it becoming an organ, well, it is an organ with the potential of becoming another. How would you perhaps describe the mode going from an organ to another? Because I think if we're thinking about this, I suppose when you're saying it's an organ, you're not thinking about this scientifically. We're talking about it kind of metaphysically, I suppose. Would you say that it is an organ in the sense of that it serves a purpose? But then how does the purpose go from being part of an organ, a tool to achieve a certain end, to becoming the end itself? Surely, if it was the tool to achieve the end, it would be separate from the end. But in some sense, you have the idea of the organ of the fetus just developing in a linear sense, and then it continues its way into personhood. So I don't necessarily view it as, I'm not so sure, even if you're just looking at it metaphysically and not scientifically, I'm not so sure whether we can truly classify it as purely an organ and nothing else, just because of how interconnected the stages are in between its organ status and a person status.
Yeah, so I think the difference between any organ, not just a fetus qua organ, but any organ that exists, and a newborn is the newborn has separation and autonomy in a way that organs do not, is what I would say. Like, you can't take a liver out of the human body and expect it to continue to exist. Now, I mean, it has a certain autonomy in that I can't directly control my liver, so that could be a possible contention to my argument, right? There's most of my organs I can't directly control unless I'm like some Taoist monk that can control all aspects of their body. But I do think that that the autonomy that any cell has is exceptionally limited in a way that a newborn doesn't have. And so this might be a problem in my argument. If I might starting to be getting too fuzzy in my definitions here. So I don't know how if you want to pick that apart or whatever. So because I'm definitely open to, I want to improve my arguments, right? Like there are deficits to the arguments that I have. For instance, one argument that I have yet to be able to fully deal with. No, one of the arguments that's still a problem for me is like Siamese twins, right? Where you essentially have two minds in one body. It's like, where's the autonomy in that? Who has proper autonomy? Can one part of the Siamese twin force the other one? So that's something that I have yet to be able to. That I think that's a flaw in my argument that I still have to fully reckon with. So yeah, I mean, so as far as going back to, I think we were talking about, the autonomy of an organ, right? The ability for it to act independently, even though it's ultimately acting for a person, right? I think I pointed out that was kind of nebulous, and so I didn't know if you wanted to kind of further explore that or pick that apart.
So I think when you're thinking about the organ, at least, I think there's a few different, I suppose, paths that one can go. I mean, first of all, I think you've raised a few of those objections quite well yourself, is that in some sense, an organ is working towards something for the host that has the organ, whereas a fetus does not necessarily work towards anything for the host, but rather works towards itself. It's almost the host is working for the fetus in some way, in the same way that, in the sense that it provides the fetus nutrients, but the fetus doesn't necessarily sustain the life of the mother. Like the existence of the fetus, well, the life of the mother isn't dependent at all on the life of the fetus. and as a result, the fetus kind of could go its own way in the future. Am I making myself not clear?
Well, the mother and its body, and even the like a biological imperative, wants to reproduce.
Yes, but then it does not need the fetus to survive, though. Like in the same way that the liver works to help the host survive. The digestive system has clear benefits directly towards the host. The fetus does not have a clear benefit towards the host in the same way that the digestive tract does or the liver does. The fetus kind of just exists within that pocket of the reproductive system and then goes off and does its own thing afterwards. In the same way that, unlike the liver, if you took it up, it wouldn't go do the same thing up, like do its own thing afterwards. The fetus would exit the mother and then do its own thing afterwards. So I think there is like some differences there between the status of the fetus and the status of an organ. So I'm not sure how much you could draw them together.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, because if we look at, what are the fundamental characteristics of a biological organism, reproduction is one of them, though it doesn't necessarily benefit the actual reproducer, but it does benefit the species. So there's almost, there's kind of a meta-telos there. I don't know if that's even the right word to describe it, but there is kind of a meta-telos there. And I also think that humans do things that aren't naturally in their own benefit, right? I don't know. Maybe I'm getting too lost here. Does that kind of make any sense?
Well, I think it does, in the sense that people do things which are not for their own benefit, and that's something you could grant. I mean, there's that entire idea in Dostoevsky where people were given everything a perfect world, they just go around and destroy it. So I mean, it's definitely something which does exist. However,
that's what I would do.
Potentially, yes, to create some strange corners of thought in the process, but I'm not sure how exactly that would apply.
Don't give me everything or superpowers. I'd probably be a villain.
No, but I'm not sure how exactly that would tie back to the abortion debate. And secondly, I do think that there is perhaps a difference between viewing the fetus as an organ and also the reproductive system as an organ, because the reproductive system is an organ to the mother, in the sense that it does provide a certain goal and does help towards the goals of the mother in most circumstances. If the mother wants to have a child, they have sex and then they have a kid, right? So that it does serve some purpose.
In most cases.
In most cases towards the mother. Yeah. Now for the fetus, on the other hand, the fetus, I think, is separate from the reproductive organ of the mother, because, well, the fetus, number one, I suppose if you're looking at it purely scientifically, it does have a different DNA. And of course you could say, well, gut bacteria and whatever have different DNA. But then at the same time, if you're looking at what bacteria is, we're not debating that the gut bacteria is literally part of the mother. We're saying the gut bacteria is a different type of bacteria, which is within the mother, but it's not exactly part of the mother. I wouldn't say the gut bacteria is part of the mother. It's
I am arguing that it's a part of the human.
Because I think the virus... Because if you got COVID and there was virus within you, now of course COVID isn't virus isn't a living thing. Would I get demonetized for saying this? Do you get demonetized for saying COVID, or is that just
I don't
something?
think so.
Well, hope not.
At least not anymore.
Well, I'm not monetized at all, so I suppose it doesn't affect me. But
I think we're fine on COVID at this point. Maybe if it was 2020, we would completely get shut down.
That is true, but I suppose
that's a whole other debate right there.
Yeah, no, who knows? But I suppose if a virus was within you, you wouldn't say the virus was part of you. You would just say it's a foreign, invasive thing within you, which is hurting you. In the same way that if you had gut bacteria, you'd say it's a foreign bacteria which has symbiotic relationship to your gut. It's not exactly part of you because it has a different DNA and whatnot. So in the same way, I would say, well, a fetus has a different DNA and is just not part of the reproductive system in that sense.
Yeah, but is gut bacteria necessary for you to live as a human?
It's necessary, but I wouldn't say it is part of you. I mean, I don't think that's a correct kind of distinction or extrapolation. In the same way that you wouldn't necessarily say oxygen is part of you, even though you necessarily need oxygen to breathe or food to eat when you're eating food. You wouldn't say the food is part of you.
You have molecules literally made out of oxygen in your body.
Yeah, but that is not there's separation between the molecules of carbon or whatnot, which is bonded to oxygen. I don't know how biology works exactly, but I would say there's a difference between the oxygen you breathe and the things which are within you. There's a difference between the red blood cells carrying oxygen within. Well, no, but then that's exactly what I was trying to point out when I was saying the mereological fallacy. Something being within something is different from something being part of that thing. So as a result, when I say the gut bacteria is within you, I'm not saying it's part of you. I'm saying it's within you. Just as when I say I am within my house, I'm not saying I'm part of the house. And when the oxygen is within your bloodstream, it's carried by your red blood cells, the hemoglobin. Your hemoglobin, the red blood cells, is part of you, but then that's a carrying of the oxygen, and not the oxygen is part of you, if you got what I mean. There's a distinction there, I would say.
Yeah, I don't know if I understand that, because again, like the oxygen is just as much a part of your and the way that it's used is just as much as part of the chemical makeup of your body, whether it's being used to create ATP, which is essentially energy, or whether it's being used in other chemical processes. Like that's a part of you, right? The energy that my mitochondria produces is part of me, is me. In the same way that, a red blood cell is me. So I don't know. I guess I'm not buying that. It might be just a point we disagree on.
Yeah. I suppose I would just try to raise an analogy just for the sake of illustration to see whether I could convince you with this analogy. But I suppose if you're in a factory and you see a conveyor belt, and the conveyor belt has or I suppose a mine shaft or whatever it is, right? That you have a conveyor belt, there's containers on the conveyor belt, and then someone puts like coal in it. Would you say the coal is part of the conveyor belt? I mean, it seems to me that the coal is more so separate from the conveyor belt, just as the end product, which is created by the conveyor belt, is separate from the factory and the processes of creation. The robots which are running the factory is separate from the stuff which is being held within the conveyor belt and the products which it creates.
But they're all part of the factory process. Yes, they're all independent things, but they're all part of the factory process, right? If a factory didn't have all those things, we would say, oh, it used to be a factory, or it's we might say it's a dead factory or an inoperative factory, right? So I guess that would be my response to that. Like, even the people that work at the factory are part of the process of the factory, despite being separate individuals and easily replaceable. As anybody in capitalism knows, you're very easily replaceable. You're always expendable. So I guess that would be my response to that. Yeah, I don't know. It hasn't convinced me yet. I'm so sorry.
I suppose this would just go on. This might go on for a bit long, so I suppose we should agree to disagree, lest we stay here all day just discussing about the metaphysics and ontology of the matter. But I suppose carrying on, I suppose, unless you have anything you want to pick apart more in our previous discussion, we could turn to the violinist argument. Is there anything else you want to discuss in a bit more detail so far?
No, I think it would be good to move to kind of the moral argument of all of this. So, so just to be, I guess I just want to like nail this down. When do you think an abortion at any point is acceptable? Or do you think as soon as the egg is fertilized, you have a completely separate human?
I think abortion at any point is impermissible, given the epistemic limitations that we have currently about the individual status of a fetus.
Okay.
I think that's the moral stance. Now, there can be evidence out there which does convince me otherwise. Yet at the same time, I do not think that evidence is given to us now, and that the majority of the evidence that we do have is in favor of the position that I currently hold, which is impermissible throughout, due to the scientific reasons I've given previously, with my argument of like it's a living human being, regardless if it's a person or whatnot. It's a living human being. For all we know, living human beings should not be terminated. Therefore, abortion is wrong. That's the stance I hold. That for all I know, that I suppose is separate from whether it's a person or not. Because I think if you're just looking at the science and you don't jump into what it means to be a person, I think you get quite a bare bones and I think a very clear distinction of the situation, I suppose.
Okay. So it seems like this argument is resting heavily on its kind of teleological possibility that it will, be born, right? That it will fully develop into a separate life,
Yes.
or that it's likely to. Okay.
Mm.
So yeah, my view on abortion is definitely, I'll admit, is a more extreme view, because I think, and this we're going to be blurring between morality and legality. I think that it should be permissible up into, like, as long as you're pregnant and it's not separate, that it should be permissible. Now, when we come to the subject of third trimester abortions, in principle, if you were 9 months and you just decided on a whim, yeah, I want to get an abortion, I would say on principle that's acceptable. In reality, the only people that ever get third trimester abortions are for one of three reasons. Either it's the life of the mother, the fetus is non-viable, or it's already stillborn, or there's like a severe fetal deformity. So Tay-Sachs disease comes to mind. And for people who are unfamiliar with Tay-Sachs disease, it's a disease that is comic to ethnic Jews, and it basically causes fats deposits to grow inside of the brain, and you can be born and live a couple years on Tay-Sachs, but you would, all the science kind of says that you're in agonizing pain the whole time. So that would be one of the acceptable that would be the fetal deformity argument of why it would be permissible to get an abortion in the third trimester. And if somebody came up to me who was 9 months pregnant and asked, do you think it's okay if I get an abortion just on a whim, right? Because most people actually agree that it's okay to get a third trimester abortion if it's like life of the mother, or viability and stuff like that. Most people really do. There are some people that don't. There are very, people that really do not. And I can go on about various politics in the U.S. But if someone came up to me and said, hey, I just want to do this on a whim, would I recommend that? No, because I think that, one, the procedure to do it is more dangerous. It's more complicated. It's just not something that I would recommend. If I were a doctor, would I perform it? No, because I think there would be serious ethical problems, and you could potentially lose your license. Like, I don't know how it is in the UK or Europe. Is UK still part of Europe, by the way? Or is that kind of an open question?
It's... Well, I'm not much keen into UK politics, but okay. I think currently, I think there, as far as I know, I think they still have, Europeans still share the status they had previously. Yet at the same time, the government is trying to separate as quickly as possible, and how that procedure is going to occur over the next few years, I have absolutely no clue. But I think that's as much as I could say.
Yeah, so I don't know how medical ethics works in Europe or the UK, but you can lose your medical license in America without ever committing a crime, right? If you, do malpractice or you engage in what is considered unethical medical behavior. And so if I was a doctor, I would not perform a third-term abortion just on a whim, because I do think that it would run into some ethical violation, right? It could put a person in more danger than giving birth. So that's kind of all of the different variant ways. In principle, yes. In reality, I don't think that ever actually happens, that people get to that late. Usually, if you get to 8-9 months, you want a baby.
Yeah.
Right. That really is the... If you've gone through that much, you really want a kid. And all the people that I've ever known or I've heard about who get third trimester abortions, it's really devastating for them, because they really did want a child, and it's just a situation where they really don't have a choice. I mean, they could die, or they don't want a fetus that's going to be born in agonizing pain, or a baby that's going to be born in agonizing pain and might die within a couple days, etc. That's the reality of it. Would I, in my own morals, would I recommend somebody do it on a whim? No. And if I was a doctor, would I perform it on a whim? No. So that's kind of how I would answer all of those different questions about when abortion should be done. But legally, I do not think the government should prohibit a person's bodily autonomy, because that's really what it comes down to me. Like I believe that you should have absolute sovereignty over your body, and I don't believe the government should have any restrictions on your bodily sovereignty. Now, that doesn't mean the government can't say, well, we have to have certain medical precautions, right? We want our hospitals to have certain standards that they can't skimp just because they want to make a profit. So I kind of agree with that. But in the United States, that is often used by pro-life groups on abortion clinics, some of which, mainly do first trimester abortions, which can either be done medically, right? You can just give someone a pill and it occurs. And there's also, very unrisky surgical things that they could do. And what we found in the United States among pro-life groups is that they will burden abortion clinics with medical requirements that are not necessary, right? They might, like they might make a requirement that's like, you have to have a hallway a certain size. And it's completely arbitrary. It has nothing to do with the actual safety of it. So in that sense, I could see, I've seen how the government has abused its ability to regulate medical processes and make sure that medicine is safe in order to do that. So that's something that I would oppose. But I do think that the state has, they do have a certain obligation to make sure that health facilities, beyond the own health facilities' ethical obligations, are being as safe as possible in that sense. But there's also, as I've seen in America, the United States, it's abused a lot for very specific political reasons, even though there's not a medical necessity for that.
Yes. Well, I suppose America is, I dare say, almost synonymous with politics, political powers being abused for whatever purposes, which may so happen, I dare say. But there's two questions I have here, just given what you've just said. On one hand, I have the question of, well, what's the reason for for you to think, at least medically or from a medical ethics perspective, of third month trimester children being ethically, well, you shouldn't do it on a whim, in so much as, I suppose, of course, this ties back a bit into the metaphysical argument we had previously. They haven't had their first breath of the world yet. So I suppose, at least from that perspective, I'm not exactly sure what the symmetry breaker is between the two perspectives. That's one question I have. And on the second question, or the second point I have, I completely agree with you that the state's goal and the state's purpose is to protect people's choices and bodily autonomy to the greatest degree. I completely agree with that. What I do think at the same time is, however, that from the arguments I've given previously, I do not think the fetus is part of the human's body, the mother's body. I simply deny the fact that when someone says one should have bodily autonomy, that the fetus is part of that bodily autonomy. I do not think that that's the case. And of course, that will tie into potential discussions about the violinist argument, and we can talk about that later. But I do think, as a third thing, an extension of that, is that the law should follow closest to should follow definitions which can have a clear and distinct definition, or at least a very clear and distinct definition, hence not metaphysical, nothing which is like, oh, this might be a person or might not be a person. It should be following at least something which is semi-agreeable on all fronts, which is the science of it, to say, well, does it follow 7 life processes? Yes or no. Does it have the potential to carry out 7 processes? Yes or no. I think those are clear arguments that can be raised. And if you follow each of those questions to the fullest extent, I think you do come to the conclusion that a fetus is a living human being, and that the law should protect that. And that is ultimately why I say, that's why I quite like the first argument that I gave, is less so about its metaphysical implications. Of course, there are metaphysical implications which I think are important, but I do think it is at least clear enough to say, well, all right, there might be further distinctions and categorizations of it, but at least from the broadest extent, these are pretty simple premises that can be followed and tested quite clearly. And I think from a pragmatic perspective as well, that is what the law should follow, I think. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, real quick, I would just say that any of these medical, ethical, and moral, to me, they all are grounded on unsaid metaphysical principles. Does that make sense? Right? Like if you absolutely believe that a human person begins at fertilization, that's a metaphysical statement.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Mm-hmm.
So all of these things, to me, are grounded on, at the very least, unsaid medical
Mhm.
unsaid metaphysical principles. And that's really why I wanted to have this discussion with you, because I had a couple other people that wanted to have an abortion debate, and it would have just been all politics, because I wanted to be able to get into the philosophy of it. Because I do believe, like, all of these things, in order to really answer that question, you do have to answer the metaphysical, or there are just metaphysical implications, is just kind of what I'm saying. As far as why would I not recommend that somebody gets a third trimester abortion on a whim, and again, I'm not a super expert on the exact medical procedures. I would not recommend it because it's more dangerous, it's more expensive. Those would be the reasons. It's
so
really
it's got nothing to do with the metaphysical principles behind it, then.
No, not for me, at least. No. And that's the thing, is like, most people would oppose on metaphysical principles, on all principles, and most forms of third trimester abortion, because if you look at pictures, it looks a lot like a baby, right? And so we kind of naturally, I mean, this is part of our literal DNA, is that when we see babies, we are attracted to them and want to care for them. It's literally part of how we've evolved, is to want to care and take care of that. So I think for a lot of people, that's why they get so skittish when it comes to third trimester, even sometimes second trimester, is why I think a lot of people get skittish. And remind me of the last thing, the other thing that you said. I apologize.
The last thing I said was purely the idea that if we're going to talk about laws, I completely agree with you about the body autonomy part. I think the role of the law is to ensure that people have the maximum amount of the maximum ability to perform choices with their own body. And I'll add a small degree to that people should also be enforced to bear the responsibilities of their action, because I think without the bear the responsibilities of the action, it's very difficult to say you should have the choice and you don't have the responsibility. I think that's a problem. And I think, although some people might say, oh, that's totalitarian, I think it's completely reasonable to say that if you're doing something, the role of the law is to make sure that you're responsible for what you've done, in the same way that, of course, clear cases, murder or whatnot, you're responsible, you've done that choice, you have to be responsible for it. But I think in the same way, it's like, if you've made a decision about something else, and I suppose in this situation it might be just promiscuous sexual behavior around the place, I'm not necessarily saying you should.
By the way, that's my favorite type of sexual behavior.
Wonderful. but I dare say that I think the law should definitely allow for that, but at the same time it should also ensure that responsibility is taken for the consequences of said action. Now, of course, on the side as well, what I was also arguing for is that I think when we're talking about the law, in order for the law to work, it has to act on very clear and presentable and well-defined scientific principles, or not even scientific, but just clear and well-defined principles. I don't think metaphysical arguments make the cut just because of how much debate there can be over it, as seen for the 1 hour of debate we've had just now on metaphysical discussions. And I think it's safe to say we're both very reasonable people, and as a result, I don't think the law can allow for such a discussion or distinctions where two reasonable people can get together and look at something and say we have two completely different conclusions. I don't think the law can allow for such vaguity. As a result, I would say the law can only base things on things which can have clear, definitive answers, like science. And I'm not saying science is God or anything like that, and not God as in a deity, but as the main fundamental principle. I'm not a proponent of scientism, but I think for what we know, at least when it comes to the debate of abortion, science is the clearest thing that we have. And in that science, what we clearly can see is the 7 life processes, and the potential is the same as actual when it comes to the application of 7 life processes to what is a living human being or not. And based on those two principles, I'll say, legally speaking, the fetus is a living human being, and as a result, no abortion. That's my take on the situation, because that's, to me, is the only clear-cut thing where you could say, all right, can it do this, can it do that, can it do that, ticks off all the boxes. Every reasonable person can look at that and say, well, all right, that's what it is. And from that perspective, I would say, yeah, that's the case. Of course, if we have further scientific developments in the future, the thing could change very easily. But for now, with what we know so far, I would say that's a good perspective to look at it legally.
Yeah, so let's just go ahead and grant that, at the moment of fertilization, that's a human person. I'll just go ahead and grant that. I think that if you were, and that it has its own body and it has a certain level of bodily sovereignty that is equivalent to all other people's. I guess what I would say is that if you were to grant, a fetus or just an unborn person, that level of bodily sovereignty, you would be granting them a type of right and sovereignty that once they're born, they'll never have, and that they'll never have throughout the rest of their life, that they can unilaterally control another person's sovereignty. Because at that point, it becomes a conflict between two different sovereignties: the sovereignty of the mother and the bodily sovereignty of the mother and the bodily sovereignty of the fetus. And I do think that the sovereignty of the mother is always going to take precedence. Now, when it comes, I don't know if that answers that question or if I can continue on.
Perhaps before we continue on, I'll just kind of raise a point which I've said previously, which was I think of the intrinsic value of a human being is tied to them both to the ability to have a right to life and a right not to perish. That's the sovereignty I'm granting. Whether that is to someone else or not is a completely different thing. I don't really care about those extrinsic factors, just because I think if you're tying directly to the most kind of structured or principled position, which is value includes a basic right to life and the right not to perish, then I think that right carries on throughout your body and throughout your life, and that doesn't change. And I'll say that that's what the right that the fetus has, and not to the mother's body or whatever it is. They have the basic right to life in the same way that I think everyone. Now, some conservatives might think I'm a bit of a communist for saying this, but I think everyone should have a basic example or a basic ability to live in the world. They shouldn't have great conditions and great phenomenal things, but I think everyone has a basic right to clean, to water to drink, basic food to sustain themselves. Of course, they don't need to eat 3-course meals a day, but if they're eating a potato every day, fine by me. But they have to have at least some basic form of sustenance that people should be working, has a moral obligation to provide to everyone. I think that's a moral obligation. So as a result, I think, from my perspective, at least under my work, I think there's a completely consistent view to say that everyone has a basic right to life, regardless of external factors. And that's just kind of the framework that I'm trying to present here. I suppose, okay, so in response to the right that they'll never have again, I would say, do you believe that people have a right to public health care, like basic public health care?
Yes, absolutely.
What's supporting public health care? I'll say taxpayers' money is supporting public health care. But then, so they're using what someone else owned in the past and what someone else earned in the past to support their life. Would you not say that's a very similar situation if you consider that we own our money?
I don't equivocate bodily sovereignty with property sovereignty.
Well, I think they are, but would you not say that one's right over one's property is the same over one's right over their body? Would you disagree with that?
No.
On what
Because I believe you have an absolute right over your body. You don't necessarily have an absolute right over your property.
So that, I suppose that might make a distinction, but I would say, well, your right over your body goes as so much as you have right over your body and not over what is not part of your body, which I argue the fetus is not part of the mother's body, which is where the distinction probably arises later on. But I would say, well, and tying it to the violinist analogy, I would say, if that is a good analogy, I think it's a false. I think it's not a good analogy, just because I think the way in which a fetus comes about is very different from the way in which a violinist wakes up and finds someone strapped to someone in a chair. I would say I don't think it's a very good analogy, and I don't really think there's any other analogy which could be raised, which is exactly the same as someone having a child or not even to use a child, like getting pregnant, right? I don't think there's any direct analogy there, but even then I would not go so far to grant that the mother has the right to terminate the fetus just because the fetus is causing an inconvenience or has problems in the future. I think that that's a completely separate discussion.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, it's not just that it's an inconvenience, it's that if you were to compare the procedure of an abortion to giving birth, we know for a fact that giving birth is medically more dangerous than having an abortion. And so, to me, if a woman wants to say, look, I don't want to take the risk of giving birth, no matter how low it is, because it could potentially, I mean, this isn't the case, probably in the case of the UK or places that have socialized Medicare, but we have, or socialized medicine. But in the US, I mean, we still have very high maternal mortality rates, especially among Black women. They just, it's like, it's insane. And so I think even if you argue it's like you made the gamble to have sex and to get pregnant, I mean, I would argue it's not a necessary consequence that you are going to get pregnant. It is a possibility. But the simple fact that it could very well be more dangerous for you to give birth is enough of a reason for you to be able to assert your own bodily autonomy over the potential of the fetus to literally cause you to die in that situation, especially because the fetus itself is completely dependent. I mean, there are, the way that even fetal cells implant themselves in the uterine, and I guess this could come down to more of a matter of perspective. You could say that it's literally, it's like an invasive thing inside of the uterine wall, and that there is this kind of back and forth challenge between these two bodies. And so just based on the fact that it's literally more dangerous to give birth than it is to terminate a pregnancy or to not be pregnant, that itself trumps whatever potential rights that a person as a fetus has. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of what my argument for that, even if you grant that a fetus is a human person, would be. So in the same sense that if we take whoever, so say you're a violinist and I am your bartender, and I just keep giving you liquor over and over, and you're an alcoholic, and you keep telling me I went to my doctor and I have liver cirrhosis and I'm going to die, and I keep manipulating you into drinking more and more, even though I know all these facts, and you get to the point where you need a liver transplant, even though I was definitely one of the people responsible for giving you liver cirrhosis. You still don't have the right to force me to do that, even though that's a case of me being responsible for you needing a part of someone else's body, potentially my own or anybody's. But just because I caused that, I still don't believe that that's enough of an obligation to force me to donate part of my liver. And so I would extrapolate that, or use that as kind of an analogy for the fetus woman dichotomy that exists. That's how I would respond, especially to the argument that, because it is a significant argument that you make, that you chose to have sex. You chose to, that can get tricky, but you had sex and there is a possibility of you getting pregnant. And so at the very least, metaphysically, there's a causal relationship. And then morally, we can go further and say, well, that's a responsibility. That causal relationship becomes a responsibility. And so, yeah, that is, even if you have that responsibility, you also have the responsibility to yourself. So if you think, hey, I mean, the risk of me giving birth and having serious complications or dying is too much, then I should be able, in order to save my own life, to be able to terminate it. Or, in the argument I just made, if I am directly responsible for you getting liver cirrhosis and you're about to die unless somebody gives you a liver transplant, and then the most likely candidate is to come to me as the person responsible, and I'm like, hey, no, liver transplant, that's too medically dangerous to me, I'm not willing to do that, I still think that holds.
Well, I think responsibility, especially, I would say responsibility, let's talk about that first, is something which is not to oneself, but towards a higher goal or a higher aim. And this might be a bit idealistic for me, but I do think that the very concept of responsibility, the difference between one acting based on responsibility or one acting based on a whim, is precisely the fact that one holds themselves to a further standard which they themselves are not part of. For example, when I say I am responsible to you, I'm not just saying I am responsible for you. I'm responsible to a duty that I have for you. So there is a further extrinsic property within the idea of responsibility. Because if it was just tied to myself, then, well, there's nothing much holding responsibility to be held. And that's why I think the law should uphold responsibility. It's because without a law, there is no practical way for people to be held responsible for what they do. In the same way, I think responsibility metaphysically requires a further thing to hold one to what they've been responsible for. Now, I suppose on the side as well, I think when you talked about the bodily sovereignty of the mother, I think there's a few things that could be raised there. Firstly, I do not think that the death of the potential death is something which is a sufficient reason to change to challenge the pre-existing or the certain death of the fetus, because on one hand we have the chance of someone potentially having complications, and then we have the chance of someone definitely being terminated. Now, of course, I should say fetus just to be scientifically accurate here, but the fetus being terminated is precisely the case that they are being terminated. The chance of giving birth may not lead to termination. And I'll also say that people's right to choice is a secondary right under the primary right which everyone has, which is the right to life, and that the right to life is the one and only right which trumps everything else. Hence why we can say people have the right to healthcare, basic healthcare and food and water, is because we respect the right to life as the fundamental right upon which people who are paying taxes, although even if they don't want the taxes to go to people's life-sustaining things, still have to pay the taxes to sustain people's lives, because we believe that people's rights is the fundamental right to life, is the fundamental right above everything else. And of course, there are other discussions around that, but I think, and it does tie into other metaphysical properties and ideas, and I suppose I'm somewhat curious to hear how you would define rights and values. But at the same time, I think that at least from the perspective of the law, I think the right to life is the fundamental right upon which most legal systems are based upon and take as a granted.
First of all, you guys heard it here first. Joshua Yen is a communist. We've determined that automatically. I want everyone to be aware.
Should I say the Russian national anthem now?
I think I have it somewhere. We could talk about that in a second, actually. The thing is that the fetus is the one with the imposition on the bodily sovereignty of the mother, right? And so, someone gets pregnant, they have responsibility. They may have responsibilities to their other children that they already have. They have a responsibility to stay alive for them. They have a responsibility to, whatever other things that are going on in their life. I think that the argument of responsibility holds equally well for those. And so the risk that could end your life, prevent you from doing that, even if it's a small one, I think that would, in my opinion, that would still hold. So that doesn't sway me personally. Did I answer your question?
I suppose the response would still be like they still have made the choice. Like if it was an active choice to have a child, I suppose, and that would still be the fundamental.
Well, it might not have been an active choice to make a child, but they made the choice to do a process that made of that. But then again, they made that same choice to have their previous children, and they still have those obligations to those previous children. So that's how I would respond. And I think this is just another area where we're going to come to an impasse on what we believe. I did want to circle back to the infanticide argument that we had made earlier. So I have read opinions that and these are, kind of ethical, it's just you're just thinking up stuff just because you can, which happens in philosophy a lot. So one argument that I heard is that because they don't believe an infant is a moral subject and has the ability to kind of display a morality or something like that, and that is apparently their determinator of personhood, they would then justify infanticide. Now, to be clear, that is not my position. I don't think whether
I'm glad not.
Yes, it's not my position. Like, whether you can be moral or not, whether you are a moral agent or not, to me is irrelevant to whether you're a person, right? A sociopath is not a moral agent, right? They don't care about morals whatsoever, and I don't think that we should just be unilaterally killing them either. So that's a position that I have discovered that is more extreme than mine. And again, my position is as long as you're still pregnant, hasn't been born, you have the right to do with your body. I don't know if you've heard if that's a convincing argument against infanticide for you, but that's just the arguments that I've heard some people try to, they do the philosophical mental masturbation of trying to really, really strain the lines of thought there. So that's why I wouldn't advocate against infanticide. Because again, my definition of a person doesn't require you be a moral agent or anything like that. It is just like what I believe is a very strong ontological shift that literally at that point includes you with the same basic, biological, metaphysical characteristics that all other humans share, that you and I share, that I don't believe are the same for someone that hasn't been born yet, for a fetus or before. So I hope that's a satisfactory argument against infanticide, in case anyone's considering it.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to proudly announce that both of us probably disagree with infanticide, but we've come to a conclusion. We've come to an agreement on one thing. Though I suppose it ties back to the idea previously. I'm just not so sure whether Heidegger would agree with the idea that if moral, with that distinction, I suppose on one sense of the moral agent distinction, and then also the idea of being thrown into the world, being a limited degree in fetuses, and then being a human being when they were born. I'm not sure whether Heidegger would agree with that kind of jump, I suppose. I mean, to me, it would seem that by virtue of entering into the world, they already become a moral agent, or in some sense, the process of becoming is precisely part of the uncovering of truth, aletheia, which is precisely the moral act, which could potentially be seen in a Kierkegaardian way, to go back to conception, which is the act of becoming. So I suppose just the underlying framework of those thinkers may not all line up, I suppose, in the same way that I suppose, I'm not saying you were trying to categorize into born and then moral agent, but at least I'm not so sure whether they would agree or line up in that way. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Whenever you're talking about Heidegger, you should stay away from morality and ethics in general.
Let's not talk about his past allegiances, but
well, trust me, I love Heidegger, but if I had met him, I'm okay with punching Nazis. I might have punched him, even though I really like his philosophy. But to be clear, actually, and this is something I disagree with Heidegger on. Heidegger didn't know if children met this definition of being in the way. He didn't know if people who have severe mental disabilities meet this definition of what he's kind of trying to figure out. So that's something I disagree with him on. I'm extending his argument for like an adult person all the way to the moment of birth. So this is something I would disagree with him on. So you're right. That specifically wouldn't be in the literature. I don't think being a moral agent has anything to do with personhood in general. I mean, it's something that can come about from personhood. It definitely comes about from, Heidegger would talk about this. One of the fundamental characteristics of being human is what in German it's called Mitsein, or being with. And again, it's his argument against Descartes' solipsism, is that we are always already part of a group of people. We always already come from others. Like we were born because two other people got together and, either made a mistake or made a choice they wanted to make. So yeah, I guess that's my response to that. And so even Heidegger has questionable views on, when a person begins that I don't subscribe to. Now, again, these are kind of like, a lot of these are lectures that he's doing. So they're kind of like one-off thoughts. They're not super, they're not thematicized very well, is how I would describe it. But when I read that, I was like, no, I'm going to reject that, Heidegger. Some we're going to disagree on.
So I suppose that disagreement between you and Heidegger potentially illustrates perhaps how I'm approaching your distinction, I suppose, ontologically between the unborn fetus and the baby, I suppose, in the same way that I think it's somewhat potentially arbitrary of that distinction being drawn, and that while there are some distinctions, perhaps what I'll be trying to present, or at least what I was trying to present, is that the distinctions between a normal human being or like human being and someone who's suffering from mental illness or like in a coma or whatnot could just be seen as significant or at least equally significant as the significant or the differences between humans, well, born babies, and the moment they were a fetus right before they were born. And I'll be like, well, that's also a difference, but it's not a significant difference enough to deny personhood, or at least to deny a sense of being in the world, I guess. And I suppose that's kind of just the perspective that I'm kind of drawing. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know. You saying this reminded me of the kind of Coma argument that we put aside earlier, of what about a person that's, for all intensive purposes, like medically, they would be considered a vegetable and they're only alive because of technology. So I would say that they still are a human being, even if they're, technically a vegetable. And the reason I would say is because another part is that they have the facticity of being a human, which I don't grant to a fetus, even though there's kind of this sedimentation that's growing up on. And when you're born, you are being thrown based on that earlier sedimentation that is related, right? It's almost like your thrownness as a fetus isn't your own. I would argue it comes from your mother. Your mother is literally giving you a type of thrownness in order so that you can start, so you can be thrown in the world. And I would say with someone in a coma, they have a historicity. They have this history of being human that isn't erased as long as they continue to be alive. So I don't consider cadavers, right, human, like living human beings or human persons. That's a strong distinction. Like, yes, they're human cadavers. They have human cells, but a person to me has to be alive. So that's the distinction I would make between like a human being and a cadaver. And of course, we do grant rights legally to cadavers, even though from my perspective as an atheist, they don't care anymore. So that would be my argument of why I think somebody that's in a coma. Also, I mean, we've heard of cases where people were in irreversible comas or they're vegetative, and they end up making complete recoveries. And maybe it's a miracle. Maybe God stepped in and did something. Who knows? But that's why I wouldn't necessarily say that they're not humans anymore. Now, I mean, that's a separate argument of whether, because obviously there's a whole argument of whether you should be able to disconnect somebody from that, right? And then that's I don't know if we want to wade into that. I don't even know if I've thematized that enough to really have a secure answer of whether you should be able to disconnect, because it brings in all these other things, medical cost and the pain of having to watch another person go through that and be in that. I don't know. What is your opinion on that of people who are? Yeah, I mean, because one, you're really just going on the medical opinion of the doctor that's saying, look, they're not coming back. They're still living, but here is a carrot, and this is equivalently what they are mentally, right? And that's a debate. I don't know how big of a debate it's been over on your side of the pond, but we have had significant debates here about people that were in what it was called irreversible comas, and whether after a certain period of time you could basically turn off the life support and you would be causing them to die. You'd be allowing them to die. So I don't know if you have an opinion on that. I think I kind of have an opinion. I have a rough opinion on it, but I want to hear yours first.
I have rough opinions, though I suppose we ought not get into it, just given how complex this debate on abortion already is. I suppose bringing in euthanasia as well, or whatever you want to call it, is perhaps even more.
I guess that would be it. That's
No,
definitely euthanasia.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll avoid that then. Maybe for the next one.
Maybe for the next debate, though I don't think I've done enough research into euthanasia to dare come up here and speak my mind about it, just because I simply just don't know enough about it, or I haven't given it enough thought. But
another thing we agree on, we haven't done enough debate on euthanasia.
Yes, definitely. Oh yes, we should all go euthanize ourselves. No, but I suppose do you have any other things that you think we haven't touched upon enough in this discussion we've had so far?
Well, if you want, I can kind of go over the really specific legality, at least in the United States, that exist around like the right of an abortion and stuff like that. So
I suppose we could touch upon it a bit, though I'm not really sure how much that would lead to debate, in the sense that I'm not much of a political thinker. Like, I don't really care too much about what the law says right now. Like, I have an idea about what the law is aiming towards, and I have an idea of what the law should be doing, but at the same time I fully recognize that there's not much I can do about it. You know, it's like Joe Biden's going to do whatever Joe Biden's doing or not doing, and
he would probably forget that he's even doing it, you know, knowing him.
I know. It is quite funny, you know, I mean.
And again, it would be, to me, irrelevant whether, you know, a national law were passed banning all abortions. That would still be completely irrelevant to me about whether I think that you should have the right, you know, to terminate a pregnancy or right to bodily sovereignty. I would still think that you should, that one ought to have that right. I would just say that, I mean, the big decision, Roe v. Wade, that was made in 1973 in America, was always on kind of shaky legal ground. Even someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who, you know, very fervently supported the right to abortion and right to, you know, basically determine your own destiny, was like, hey, we should really rethink this. And it was based on this idea that people have a fundamental right to privacy, which I do think people should have a right to privacy. And it's based in the United States Constitution kind of implicitly on the Fourth Amendment, which is the prohibition against search and seizure. But it's also, it's implied in the 14th Amendment on something called substantive due process, that the state should not be able to invade personal private decisions. So the same argument was used for contraception, for interracial marriage. All of those things are based on this kind of fundamental right to privacy. But I mean, I would really argue more that prior to that, and that I think the Constitution is more clear, at least our Constitution is, that you should have a right to bodily sovereignty. That even if, like, you know, I mean, life, liberty, and property, and the way that in capitalist system, I know that I disagreed with this earlier, but capitalism does view the body as your property, right? Your property starts at the very least from your body. And if you're a wage laborer, that's what you're selling. You're selling your bodily property in order to get a wage. And so I would argue that in and of itself, right? That just goes back to the bodily autonomy thing, that the US Constitution does do that. When I looked up the UK, there's basically 4 different ways that you can get an abortion, you know, life of the mother, viability, and stuff like that. And it pretty much, I think it stops at 28 weeks in the UK. But one of the options is, you know, there's some vague risk to the mother, but the way that it's treated in practice allows for basically abortion on demand in the UK prior to 28 weeks. And in both the UK, and just in case the UK isn't part of Europe, in Europe as well, they do have their laws on abortion are typically between 20 and 28 weeks. However, the big distinction is that there are exceptions that allow for, third trimester abortions are much more left up to doctors to decide than in America. Most abortion laws in America, even really restrictive ones, claim that, well, exceptions are life of the mother, rape, incest, etc., like that. However, in practice, doctors are so afraid to do that because the laws are written very vaguely. And a lot of times, especially since Roe v. Wade got overturned last year with the Dobbs decision, the only way a doctor will actually feel comfortable doing it is if you're essentially on death's door. So the doctor could say early on, it's like, hey, in 4 weeks, you're going to be septic and this will kill you. But the law wouldn't allow them to perform an abortion until literally they're right on death's door. And so these exceptions that are allowed in a lot of places in the United States, and this is one of the reasons I think it's very dangerous, and you should be leaving it far more up to doctors, endangers people that based on their own, based on what they think is that, hey, these exceptions should be allowed, don't actually allow for them. And so that's just a little explanation of some of the legal problems that come around. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I don't think we should have laws, and that we should leave it up to the medical community to kind of decide their own ethics on what they decide to do. Both because practically nobody in the third trimester is on a whim getting an abortion. It's only occurring because viability, life of the mother, severe deformity. But it's kind of like if you're going to need emergency assistance because you got fired. A lot of times they won't give you that emergency assistance till you've already been given like an eviction notice, even though a month ahead of time that this is an inevitability. Yeah. Right? And then you already have the eviction on your record. So you could be 4 weeks before it could be stillborn. You could have a dead fetus inside of you, and in 4 weeks you're going to be septic. And so the idea is, well, it's safer now to remove it at this point instead of waiting till you're on death's door. But the way that the laws are written, doctors really, they don't feel comfortable doing that, even though they want to be able to provide that. And I guess this will get into another disagreement of whether is abortion healthcare. And I do believe abortion is healthcare. And I think you probably agree in those exceptions, life of the mother, yes, is that it is in fact healthcare. And so our disagreement would be, when is it healthcare, etc.
Yeah. Well, I think it's healthcare precisely when it is healthcare, in the sense that when health is indeed concerned. I don't think health is concerned in the other circumstances of like two teenagers having sex and then they suddenly get pregnant. I wouldn't necessarily consider that being healthcare, just because no one's health is technically at risk. Like, of course, there's inherent risks of someone giving birth, but then there's also technical risks in someone walking across the road. And you wouldn't necessarily say a traffic light's healthcare either. I wouldn't necessarily go so far to say that. If you got
I don't know. So, I don't know that's a fair comparison right there.
Yeah, well, but you got my point, right? I mean, I think there's inherent risks in everything, and when you're doing things, you have to accept that there are inherent risks in what you're doing, and one should bear the responsibility for the risk that one occurs. For example, if one goes gambling in a gambling den, they accept the risk that they might win, and they also accept the risk that they might lose. I don't think people should go into the gambling den and then they get completely bankrupt and say it's healthcare that the banking den excuses them of their debt. I think they ought to take responsibility of it.
I think I'm not saying the healthcare debate a little bit.
No, but I mean, I can see like if someone's but if someone has like depression, right, from being broke, from gambling, that's different from someone actually genuinely having depression and having suicidal thoughts because of them naturally having imbalance in their head. I would say that's healthcare to help them. But like,
wait a minute. I mean, wouldn't it be healthcare to address what is obviously a gambling addiction?
Well, I'll say that gambling addiction is separate from the health that's being occurred. I mean, yes, it is technically healthcare in helping them deal with their gambling addiction. It might be healthcare to deal with someone's sex addiction as well, if that even exists. But to say
there are people that are that. Well, I mean, with the gambling thing, it's like you're literally getting a high from gambling. I mean, in America, we've been trying to move away from looking at addictions as like criminal behavior, especially when it comes to drugs, which are illegal. and more towards recognizing them as healthcare issues. And so, for somebody that has a gambling addiction, like they are getting a high that they feel that they absolutely need. I mean, it's a serotonin thing at a certain point. And so I could see treating that as the reason I'm bringing this up because you seem to make a distinction between legitimately being depressed and a non-legitimate form of depression. Now, there can be other extraneous circumstances that aren't related to healthcare that should be addressed differently. But I would consider being addicted to gambling as a healthcare issue that you need to work on. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be responsible for the other problems that you call. Just like if you're drinking and driving, you have a mental health problem because you're addicted to alcohol, but you're still committing committing a crime. You're doing something wrong, especially if you get into a crash, and you should still be held responsible for that. I agree with that. So,
well, I think I wasn't very clear before, and I think I wasn't presenting it very clear. I think there's a difference between healthcare as healthcare simpliciter and healthcare as just healthcare that one person is entitled to. I think one is entitled to and not being responsible for if they had a pregnancy in the 3rd trimester and they're dying. That's something I think people should be entitled to, that care. Whereas if someone just had a kid and because they were just having promiscuous sex or whatnot, and they weren't intending to have a kid, but they had a kid, that's inherent risk. And that I don't think is healthcare that they're entitled to in any sense of the imagination, just as I don't think one is entitled to alleviation of their gambling debt, even though, of course, the situation in both situations aren't necessarily ideal. Whereas, of course, if someone got their house robbed and they were broke and like tragedy strikes and whatnot, then I think there's different accountability and different solutions for that as well.
Okay, I can understand that.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. Do you want to end this with a prayer? Do you want to pray for me?
Well, I've been prayed for by so many different Catholics that I'm not exactly sure what type of prayer I should give, even if I was asked to pray. I'm not exactly sure where to start. I'm not much in the mood of praying for. Well, I do pray for people, but I don't necessarily do that on stream too much or on videos too much.
Oh well, I mean, I'm giving you the opportunity to pray for an atheist.
Well,
to an abortion supporting atheist.
Yes, no, I should bring you to the south and pray for your I don't know what I should pray for in that situation, but I suppose if you do offer me the opportunity to pray, then I suppose we should pray. Dear God, thank you for giving us this wonderful discussion together. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to exchange our ideas about a key topic like abortion. Be with both of us as we go through our daily lives, Lord. Help us feel your love and guidance and your support through our lives, through tough times and through good times, Lord. Help us be appreciative for the gifts you've given us and help us look forward to the future and what you have in store for us, Lord, with an open heart. Be with us and guide us. In your name we pray. Amen.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And for everyone watching, don't forget to like and subscribe to both of our channels, Philosophy for All and Zach's Strange Corners of Thought. Definitely, help Josh out. Just put some of his videos on play and go do some errands because he deserves that watch time. He deserves to be monetized. He works hard for it. YouTube needs to stop exploiting this monetized. Yeah, it needs to stop exploiting our free labor. So
yes,
definitely help out Josh. I definitely appreciate his channel. You actually have more than one channel, right?
Yes, I run 3 channels actually. I have this channel, and then I have a personal vlogging channel where I kind of bring people through life in Oxford, teach kind of students how to make the most of their high school experience. And I have a 3rd one which kind of helps you get into university. So I talk about how to write your personal statements, coming at UCAS Ivy Leagues. I talk about that in that 3rd channel. So I do a few things. Yeah.
Don't you have a gaming channel?
I shut down my gaming channel. Well, it's still up there. The content's still there, but I stopped making videos for it. I felt it's like. Actually, that is actually the closest channel to get monetized, even though it has less subscribers.
That's what I thought.
But then I just decided to stop just because I was like, I don't really want to do this in the long term, so I may as well stop it now before it actually gets monetized. And I then feel like, okay, I'm actually making money from this. I should keep on doing it, So,
bro, I support you getting that monetized. So like my other channel.
Well, that's it for the video. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Hope you found it edifying and fruitful. If you want to support us, go check us out on Patreon or just like and subscribe and share it to your friends if you found it helpful. Stay safe, my friends. See you soon. Thank you for watching. God bless. If you're an atheist, well, God bless, I suppose, as well. And I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching and goodbye.
And we will see you the next time you make a wrong turn in one of our strange corners of thought.
Wonderful. I'll see you soon.